The alien combat instructor had seen it all. For centuries, he had trained the fiercest warriors from across the galaxy, each one more skilled than the last. He had been a teacher, a tactician, and a master of countless fighting styles. His reputation was unrivaled. He had earned the respect of his peers and the fear of his enemies. Nothing, he believed, could surprise him anymore. But today was different. The warm-up had started like any other. The instructor had set up the sparring session in a quiet, isolated chamber, preparing for the usual display of strength and skill. His pupil, a young alien combatant from a far-off system, had faced many battles already and had proven his worth in training. Today, however, he was to face the one who had taught the galaxy's finest, himself. The instructor stood tall, his multiple limbs flexing with controlled power. He observed the young warrior, preparing for what would surely be an easy match. His eyes glowed with the confidence that only years of battle experience could provide. The young warrior, his name unknown to many, known only as a representative from the death world, bent his knees slightly, ready to begin. But as the first move was made, the instructor froze. The warrior's stance was unlike anything he had ever seen. The speed, the grace, the raw intensity in every shift of his body, it was alien. With a swift motion, the warrior lunged forward. The instructor instinctively moved to block, but the impact was unlike any he had ever felt before. The young warrior's strike didn't just meet the instructor's defense, it shattered it, sending waves of energy through his own body. The combat instructor staggered back, barely keeping his balance. He hadn't even seen the move coming. But it wasn't the strength of the strike that confused him. It was the sheer unpredictability. This wasn't just another sparring session. This was something else. The instructor had never fought against anything that felt so untamed. Again, the instructor growled, his voice low but steady, as he regained his stance. His pride wouldn't allow him to show weakness, not now. The Deathworlder wasn't fazed. He seemed to move without hesitation, without fear. There was no calculation in his movements, no typical strategy. Instead, it was an unrestrained flow of action, a battle-hardened instinct that came from surviving a harsh, unforgiving world. His actions didn't follow any pattern the instructor recognized. The combat instructor charged, attempting to regain control of the fight. He aimed a precise strike at the warrior's torso. It was a move that had ended many battles, one that no opponent had ever avoided. But the Deathworlder ducked low, his body moving with such fluidity that the instructor couldn't even track the movement. The warrior wasn't just evading, it was as if he anticipated every attack before it even happened. With one motion, the Deathworlder twisted and slammed his fist into the instructor's side. The force of the blow sent him crashing to the floor, his chest heaving for air. The instructor's body screamed in pain, but his mind was even more stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. The young warrior stood above him, silent, unmoving. He didn't speak, didn't gloat. His eyes were calm, almost curious. There was no aggression in his gaze, only the quiet understanding that, in this moment, he had won. The combat instructor lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to move for a few long moments. His mind raced, trying to process what had just occurred. How had this happened? How had he, a being so skilled in the ways of combat, been so thoroughly outmatched by someone who had never known the luxury of formal training? What was the source of this power? His pride, once unshakable, began to crumble. He had been humbled in an instant by a warrior who barely seemed to try. The alien instructor knew that he had to get up, to finish this fight, but a small, nagging feeling inside him couldn't ignore the question that now echoed in his mind: was this truly a warm-up, or had he underestimated his opponent far more than he had ever realized? The combat instructor lay on the cold, smooth floor, chest heaving, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Pain surged through his body from the unexpected strike. His ribs ached with every breath, and the sting of humiliation burned hotter than the physical discomfort. His pride, which had been the foundation of his entire career, now lay in tatters. He slowly rose, wincing as he placed his hand on the floor for support. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. How could he, one of the galaxy's most experienced warriors, be so thoroughly outmatched by a creature so foreign to him? He was no stranger to facing deadly opponents. He had fought and trained some of the most fearsome beings in the universe. Yet nothing had prepared him for this. The Deathworlder had fought with an unpredictability he couldn't fathom, an untamed ferocity that didn't follow any pattern, any structure, any rules of combat he had mastered. As he stood shakily, dusting himself off, the instructor tried to regain his composure. He couldn't show weakness. Not now, not in front of the warrior. His reputation would be shattered forever. His mind was quick, always calculating, always strategizing. Yet none of that had mattered in that moment. Focus, he told himself, closing his eyes for a moment to regain his composure. You can't let pride blind you. You need to understand your enemy. The Deathworlder wasn't just a creature of raw power. No, this was something else. This wasn't about strength alone. The warrior had fought with an edge that came from surviving on a world that had no mercy. The instructor could feel that, deep down, the Deathworlder's strength was a product of harsh survival, of living on a planet that offered no forgiveness. For the first time in his long career, the combat instructor realized something that shook him to his core. He had been training to fight in a controlled environment, one where everything had rules. But this Deathworlder? His world had no rules. His fight wasn't dictated by technique or training. It was purely instinctive, driven by the fight for survival itself. The combat instructor's arrogance had been his downfall. For centuries, he had believed that knowledge and skill could overcome anything, that strategy would always win. But the Deathworlder had shown him that brute survival instincts could trump all of that. This fight wasn't just about strength. It was about a raw, unrefined form of combat that the instructor had never considered, until now. Enough thinking, the instructor muttered. It's time to show him who I am. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. His limbs flexed, gathering energy for another attack. This time, he would not underestimate the Deathworlder. This time, he would match him with his experience, with every combat technique at his disposal. This time, there would be no surprises. He turned to face the Deathworlder, whose quiet stance hadn't shifted at all. The warrior hadn't even broken a sweat. There was a calmness about him, almost as if he knew this fight would. The instructor could feel the intensity in his eyes, the confidence of a being who had lived through things the instructor couldn't even begin to imagine. For the first time in a long while, the instructor was faced with a situation where he wasn't in control. And it unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. Let's see how you handle my real strength, the instructor declared, voice laced with both frustration and determination. The Deathworlder gave no response. Instead, he simply lowered his body slightly, almost as if waiting for the instructor to make his move. There was something unsettling about the way the warrior moved, so fluid, so unburdened by any tactics or strategies. The combat instructor lunged forward, a blur of speed and power, aiming a powerful strike at the warrior's midsection. But once again, the Deathworlder effortlessly sidestepped, his movements far too quick to track. And then it happened. The instructor felt a sharp pain in his abdomen as the Deathworlder's knee collided with him, sending him staggering back. His vision blurred for a moment, but he held himself together, refusing to show weakness. The Deathworlder wasn't just fighting, he was toying with him. The combat instructor gritted his teeth, refusing to let himself be outclassed again. This time, he would get it right. This time, he would adapt. But as he prepared for another assault, something nagging at the back of his mind made him stop. He realized that the Deathworlder wasn't just outmaneuvering him. The warrior wasn't even fighting with full force. He was holding back, waiting, observing. What was the Deathworlder thinking? What game was he playing? The instructor had no answers yet, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary warrior. And today, he was going to have to learn more than just combat. He was going to have to learn how to survive in a world where instincts, and not skills, determined who lived and who died. The combat instructor took another step back, his breath still ragged from the last exchange. He wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to collect himself. His mind raced. Every move the Deathworlder made seemed so effortless, so smooth, as if the warrior had an uncanny understanding of the battle before it even began. "Focus," the instructor muttered under his breath. He needed to think clearly, to figure out what he was dealing with. He had never faced anything like this before. The Deathworlder's fighting style was unlike anything he had ever seen in his long career. It wasn't that the warrior was faster, or stronger. It was that he seemed to move with a kind of wild precision, like he was attuned to the rhythm of the fight on a level the instructor could not comprehend. The instructor's previous confidence had been replaced by a creeping sense of doubt. He had always believed that no opponent could truly surpass him if he had enough time to prepare, enough time to think through every possible outcome. Yet here he was, locked in a fight with someone whose abilities defied logic. The Deathworlder stepped forward, his movements still fluid and calm. It was as though he hadn't even exerted himself yet. The instructor tried to read his body language, but there was nothing to go on. No arrogance. No fear. Just quiet anticipation. "Tell me," the instructor began, his voice a little hoarse from the strain of battle, "where did you come from?" The Deathworlder didn't answer, of course. Words weren't needed in a fight like this. The warrior was speaking with his body, his every motion a declaration of dominance. For a moment, the instructor's mind wandered back to the legends of the Deathworlders. He had heard stories of their ferocity, their ability to survive in the harshest environments. These were beings who had learned to adapt and thrive on planets that would break lesser creatures. Their home worlds were filled with dangers that would make even the toughest warriors from the instructor's own species hesitate. And yet, despite the stories, the instructor never truly understood what made these creatures so formidable. Until now. The Deathworlder wasn't just a fighter. He wasn't just strong or fast. He was a living weapon, honed by the harshest conditions imaginable. Every movement he made seemed to be an extension of his environment, a perfect synchronization between body and world. The instructor had been trained to fight in controlled spaces, where tactics and rules dominated. But the Deathworlder fought in a way that could only be described as primal, instinct over intellect, raw power over refined technique. Suddenly, the Deathworlder's eyes flashed. Without warning, he lunged, moving faster than the instructor could react. It was a blur, a streak of motion so sudden and unpredictable that the instructor barely had time to register it. The strike landed on his shoulder, a sharp jab that sent shockwaves through his body. Pain flared, and the instructor staggered backward, barely managing to stay on his feet. The warrior's attack wasn't just fast, it was precise, hitting exactly where it would destabilize him the most. It was as if the Deathworlder knew exactly where his weaknesses lay, not from any study of his body, but from an innate, almost animal-like understanding of combat. The instructor's heart pounded in his chest. His mind screamed for him to counterattack, to find a way to regain control of the fight. But it was clear now, this wasn't a battle of strength or skill. It was a battle of survival, and the Deathworlder was winning. Why are you doing this?" The words slipped out before the instructor could stop them, a mix of frustration and awe. He had never been in a fight where he didn't know the answer. This wasn't just about defeating an opponent, it was about understanding the very nature of the fight itself. The Deathworlder's gaze met his, unwavering and calm. It was as if the warrior was waiting for something. Waiting for the instructor to understand, to finally accept what was happening. It wasn't just the Deathworlder's strength that was remarkable. It was his entire being, the way he fought, the way he moved. Every action was an extension of his world, a world where only the fittest survived. The instructor now saw that the true power of the Deathworlder wasn't in his physical abilities, but in his ability to live beyond the laws of combat. He was a product of a planet where every fight was a battle for survival, where every moment could be your last. As the instructor stumbled back to regain his footing, something inside him began to shift. His arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, was being replaced by something new. Respect. Respect for the Deathworlder's sheer will to survive. Respect for the power that came not from training or knowledge, but from an inherent connection to the most fundamental truth of all, that life, in its purest form, was about survival. And the Deathworlder had mastered that truth. The instructor's eyes narrowed as he locked onto the warrior once more. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, he wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to understand. The instructor stood tall, his body still aching from the blows he had received, but now his mind was clearer. It was no longer about overpowering the Deathworlder, it was about adapting to the wild, untamed style that this warrior embodied. For the first time, the combat instructor recognized that this fight wasn't going to follow any of his usual tactics. It wasn't a battle where skill alone would prevail. This was survival, pure and simple. The Deathworlder didn't speak. He didn't need to. The warrior's presence alone was enough to make the instructor feel like an amateur, as if he were a mere pawn in a game played by forces far beyond his comprehension. Every move the Deathworlder made was fluid, instinctual, as though his body had been forged in the most unforgiving of environments. The instructor knew, deep down, that this was not just a fight, it was a test of endurance, of adaptation, of true power. The two warriors circled each other, sizing up their opponent. The instructor's movements became more deliberate, every step measured as he calculated his next move. He knew the Deathworlder was watching, waiting. It wasn't just about speed or strength anymore. It was about the unpredictability of every strike, the rawness of every motion. Without warning, the Deathworlder lunged again, faster than the instructor had anticipated. The instructor barely had time to block before the warrior's fist crashed into his chest. The force of the blow sent him reeling, and he stumbled back, barely managing to stay on his feet. For a brief moment, the instructor felt something he had never felt before in the middle of a fight, fear. It was not the fear of defeat, but the fear of the unknown. This Deathworlder was something he couldn't understand. The instructor had spent years studying combat, breaking down every fighting style and every technique. He had faced enemies from across the galaxy, each one more challenging than the last. But the Deathworlder's style, it defied everything he knew. It wasn't about technique. It wasn't about tactics. It was a form of combat driven by something deeper, something primal. As the Deathworlder advanced, the instructor raised his arm to block a second strike. This time, he was more focused. His muscles burned with exertion, but his mind was sharper, clearer. He moved to counterattack, launching a series of quick jabs at the warrior's torso, hoping to find an opening. But the Deathworlder reacted with the same fluidity as before, dodging, weaving, and anticipating each move before the instructor could even execute it. Frustration began to build inside the instructor. He could feel his control slipping. The Deathworlder wasn't just countering his moves, he was reading him. His every movement seemed to come from a place the instructor couldn't reach, a place beyond his understanding. The instructor tried to shake off the growing sense of helplessness. He had faced tougher foes in his career, but none who had fought like this. None who had moved like this. None who had made him feel like he was an outsider in his own fight. A new plan began to form in the instructor's mind, but the Deathworlder's next move made him hesitate. With a sudden twist of his body, the warrior ducked under the instructor's arm, closing the gap between them in an instant. The instructor barely had time to react before the Deathworlder's knee slammed into his midsection. The wind was knocked out of the instructor's lungs, and he staggered back, gasping for breath. He could feel the sting of every impact, each blow landing harder than the last. It was as if the Deathworlder was learning him, understanding the limits of his body, predicting every movement before it even happened. As the instructor struggled to regain his footing, he realized something that struck him deeply: the Deathworlder wasn't just fighting him physically. He was testing him. Every strike, every move, was designed to push the instructor to his limits, to force him to evolve in real time. It wasn't just a battle, it was a trial. And for the first time, the instructor found himself questioning whether he could pass it. The Deathworlder paused, standing still for a moment. He seemed to be waiting, as though inviting the instructor to continue. The calmness in the warrior's posture contrasted sharply with the chaos of the fight, as if the Deathworlder knew something the instructor didn't. There was no arrogance, no overconfidence in his stance, just patience, as though he were willing to give the instructor a chance to prove himself. The instructor swallowed hard. Sweat dripped down his face, but his mind had never been more focused. This was no longer about overpowering the Deathworlder. It was about understanding him, matching his rhythm, adapting to his way of fighting. You want to test me?" The instructor's voice was hoarse, but determined. "Then you'll see what I'm truly capable of." The Deathworlder didn't reply, but his eyes glinted with what might have been the faintest spark of recognition. And then, without warning, the fight resumed. The instructor, now more attuned to the unpredictability of the warrior's movements, launched himself forward with renewed energy, hoping to surprise the Deathworlder with a different approach. The battle was far from over. But now, the instructor understood. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about growing, adapting, and evolving in the face of an enemy who could teach him more than he could ever learn from any textbook or battle strategy. The combat instructor's mind raced as he tried to anticipate the next move. The Deathworlder was unlike any opponent he had ever faced. Every strike, every movement, was unpredictable, and each one seemed to take the instructor further out of his comfort zone. For a moment, he felt a surge of anger, a flare of resistance against the realization that he was struggling so much. "I am the master of this arena," he thought. "I am the one who has trained the greatest warriors in the galaxy. How can this creature, this untamed beast, defy everything I know?" But the Deathworlder didn't seem to care about the instructor's inner turmoil. The warrior was patient, observant, almost as if waiting for the instructor to figure out the answer himself. The calmness in the warrior's eyes unsettled the instructor further. It was as though the Deathworlder knew something he didn't, knew that eventually, the instructor would be forced to confront the truth. The instructor, still breathing heavily, pressed on, attacking with new fury. He hurled a flurry of blows at the Deathworlder, left, right, uppercut, and sweep, all expertly calculated and delivered with the precision of years of experience. But each one was met with effortless evasion, each strike only grazing the Deathworlder as he twisted and dodged with a fluidity that made the instructor feel clumsy in comparison. In the midst of his attack, the instructor felt a sharp pain in his side. It was a fleeting moment, but it sent a ripple of shock through his body. He hadn't seen the strike coming. The Deathworlder's knee had connected with his ribs, and now the instructor was struggling to breathe, his body screaming in protest. His pride, once his greatest weapon, was now his greatest weakness. He had underestimated his opponent, and it was becoming painfully clear that he would have to learn a new way to fight. The Deathworlder didn't move. He stood silently, watching the instructor recover. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no pride. Only a quiet patience. The instructor, now gasping for air, straightened himself, forcing his body to obey. He felt the ache in his chest, his side, but this was no time to retreat. This was the moment where his true character, his true ability as a fighter, would have to emerge. I can't just rely on what I know, the instructor thought. I have to evolve. With every ounce of strength he could muster, the instructor lunged forward again, but this time, he didn't just rely on his speed or his technique. He focused on the rhythm of the fight, on the movements of the Deathworlder. He tried to forget the precision of his strikes and instead allowed his instincts to guide him, mirroring the wild unpredictability of his opponent. This time, it worked. The Deathworlder's body tensed, his posture shifting as the instructor's blow landed with surprising accuracy. But it wasn't the punch itself that surprised the Deathworlder, it was the change in the instructor's approach. The Deathworlder's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing his face for the first time since the fight began. The instructor smiled, a flash of victory in his eyes. He had finally connected. He wasn't simply mimicking the Deathworlder's movements anymore. He was becoming part of the flow, part of the unpredictable rhythm of the fight. The instructor had always believed that combat was a battle of the mind. But now, he was beginning to understand that it was also about surrendering to the chaos, accepting the raw energy of the fight. For a moment, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in centuries. The instructor was no longer just the teacher, the expert, the one with all the answers. Now, he was simply a fighter, a warrior in the truest sense of the word, struggling to survive in a world that had no rules. But just as quickly as the victory surged through him, it was gone. The Deathworlder had already recovered, moving faster than the instructor could react. With a swift motion, the Deathworlder spun and slammed his elbow into the instructor's back, sending him crashing to the floor once again. This time, the pain was more intense. The instructor couldn't breathe. His vision swam, and the world seemed to spin as the Deathworlder loomed above him, his gaze unwavering. The instructor lay there, struggling to rise, his body too battered to obey his commands. He had fought, yes, but at what cost? The arrogance that had once fueled him was now completely gone. It was no longer about winning. It was about surviving. It was about understanding just how fragile his position was in this fight, and how much he still had to learn. The Deathworlder didn't take advantage of the moment. He stood over the instructor, silently watching. There was no malice in his gaze, only that same quiet patience. It was as if the warrior knew that this was a lesson, a turning point for the instructor. And the instructor could feel it, the lesson was clear, but it was one he had never been willing to accept until now. For the first time in his career, the combat instructor felt like a student again. He wasn't the master. He wasn't the one who knew everything. He was just a man facing a force beyond his comprehension, forced to confront his limitations. The Deathworlder had humbled him in ways that would forever change his approach to combat, to life itself. "Get up," the Deathworlder's voice was low, almost a challenge. The instructor didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply pushed himself up, slowly, deliberately. His chest was still tight, his body aching, but his mind was clearer than ever before. He wasn't just fighting anymore. He was learning. The Deathworlder had taken him to the edge of his understanding, and now, he would push forward. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something much deeper, something far beyond mere combat. The combat instructor took a moment to gather himself, wiping the blood from his lips, and straightening his posture. He had been pushed to his absolute limits, both physically and mentally. His body burned with the memory of every blow he had taken, every strike that had nearly shattered his will. But something had changed inside him. The lesson was starting to sink in. He couldn't win this fight with arrogance or pride. He had to change. But just as the instructor steadied himself, a voice broke through the tense silence of the arena. "Step aside." The voice was unfamiliar, yet sharp, and it startled both the instructor and the Deathworlder. The instructor, still struggling to catch his breath, turned his head, trying to focus on the new presence. The Deathworlder didn't move, but his body tensed slightly, his eyes narrowing, though he made no hostile gesture. Through the dim light of the chamber stepped a human, tall and lean, dressed in simple clothing. His face was stern, but there was a quiet confidence about him that immediately drew the instructor's attention. The human's arrival seemed almost surreal. This wasn't a soldier or warrior, but a figure out of place in such a brutal confrontation. You're human, the instructor muttered, his voice hoarse. His surprise was evident, but there was also a sense of relief. For the first time since the battle began, the instructor wasn't alone in this strange new world of combat. I've seen enough, the human replied, his gaze shifting to the Deathworlder. You're both wasting time fighting the wrong battle. The combat instructor blinked in confusion. Wasting time? They had been locked in a brutal, exhausting fight for hours. How could this human, who was so clearly out of his element, make such an assertion? But before he could voice his frustration, the human turned to face him. You're too focused on what you know. Too focused on your training and tactics. That's why you're losing. His words were calm but forceful, piercing through the instructor's growing frustration like a sharp knife. You can't beat him using your old methods. You have to think differently. The combat instructor's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. This was a challenge. A foreign human, one who clearly had no combat experience, was now offering advice on how to defeat the very warrior who had nearly bested him. How could someone so seemingly weak possibly have any understanding of this fight? But something in the human's eyes, the quiet strength, the certainty of his tone, compelled the instructor to listen. The human continued. The Deathworlder isn't fighting with technique. He's fighting with instinct. He doesn't care about structure or rules. He's alive in the moment. You're not. You're thinking too much. You need to surrender to the chaos of the fight and become one with it. That's how you'll stand a chance. The instructor's mind buzzed with the human's words. Could it really be that simple? Surrender to the chaos? The idea was ludicrous. For centuries, the instructor had prided himself on his discipline, his control over every battle. Every move had been carefully calculated, every action planned down to the finest detail. The idea of giving up control was unfathomable. Yet, deep down, something about the human's words resonated. The Deathworlder, still standing in the corner of the room, seemed to have grown bored of the conversation. He shifted his weight, as if waiting for the fight to continue. The instructor, still processing the human's advice, nodded slowly. All right, the instructor said, his voice growing steadier. He was still injured, still aching, but now there was something different in his expression, a flicker of determination. Let's see if I can surrender to the chaos, then. Without warning, the instructor launched himself forward, this time with no plan, no strategy, just an instinctive urge to act. The Deathworlder was quick, but so was the instructor now. He didn't think, he simply moved. The fight was different now. The instructor felt the world around him shift as he allowed himself to move with the flow of battle. Every strike was less about precision and more about rhythm, about the space between attacks, the moments of stillness where his body could move as one with the fight. The Deathworlder reacted, just as fast, just as unpredictably, but this time, the instructor was no longer caught off guard. His strikes were not perfect, but they were fluid. He was no longer controlling the fight, but rather, letting the fight control him. The Deathworlder seemed surprised, his movement stalling for just a fraction of a second, and the instructor saw it, a window. With a swift motion, the instructor struck with all the raw force he had left, landing a blow that rocked the Deathworlder off balance for a moment. The Deathworlder recovered quickly, but the instructor had felt it. He had made contact. He had found a way to break through the unpredictable rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The human, still standing on the sidelines, nodded approvingly. You're getting it, he said, his tone calm but knowing. For the first time, the combat instructor didn't feel like a teacher. He didn't feel like the greatest fighter in the galaxy. He felt like a student, one who had finally begun to understand the true nature of the fight. It wasn't about strength or skill alone. It was about adaptability, surrendering to the chaos and trusting that, in the end, the fight would show him the way forward. The Deathworlder, noticing the shift in the instructor's approach, seemed to become more engaged. His movements grew sharper, his attacks more precise, but the instructor didn't flinch. He was ready now. Ready to dance with the chaos. And in that moment, with the human silently watching from the side, the instructor knew that this battle had transformed him. He was no longer fighting to win. He was fighting to learn. The instructor was no longer the proud combat master who had walked into the arena believing that skill alone could win any fight. He had faced his limits, felt his pride shatter, and learned to surrender to the chaos of battle. And now, as the fight reached its climax, he knew there was one final lesson to learn, not just for this fight, but for his entire life. The Deathworlder's movements had become more aggressive, his strikes more calculated. It was clear the warrior had recognized the shift in the instructor's approach. The fight had escalated once again, each combatant pushing themselves further than they ever had before. But it wasn't just physical strength that mattered anymore. As the instructor dodged a powerful blow, he realized that he had stopped thinking about winning or losing. His focus was no longer on overcoming the Deathworlder, but on something deeper, the realization that the true battle was within himself. With each moment, he grew more fluid, more aligned with the rhythm of the fight. His body no longer fought against the chaos, it embraced it. Every strike, every parry, became an expression of the instinct that had been buried deep inside him. He was no longer trying to defeat the Deathworlder, he was simply fighting. He was living in the moment, immersed in the art of survival, the art of becoming one with the battle. The Deathworlder, for the first time, seemed to hesitate. His strikes slowed, his movements less sure. It was as if he had met an opponent who could match him not in strength, but in spirit. The instructor's body ached, his muscles screaming in protest, but his mind was clear, calm, and steady. He had found the flow of the fight, the pulse that connected him to the warrior before him. In that single moment, everything clicked. The instructor didn't need to be the best fighter in the galaxy. He didn't need to be the teacher who had the answers. What mattered was his ability to adapt, to learn, to become something more than just a warrior. He had learned to embrace the unknown, to fight not for victory, but for the experience itself. And then, in a final, synchronized moment, the instructor moved. Not with power or technique, but with pure instinct. His hand reached out, catching the Deathworlder's arm mid-strike. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but in that moment, both warriors knew that the battle had shifted. The Deathworlder's expression softened, and there was a brief pause, a moment of mutual respect between them. The fight ended, not with a crushing blow, but with an understanding. The Deathworlder nodded, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and acceptance. The instructor, battered and bruised, stood tall. The human ally watched from the side, a quiet smile on his face. The instructor didn't need words now. He had learned what he needed to. He had learned that true strength didn't lie in victory or dominance. True strength came from understanding one's own limitations, understanding the world around you, and understanding your opponent as more than just a challenge to overcome. It came from the willingness to adapt, to evolve, and to embrace the unknown. As the instructor looked at the Deathworlder, now standing in silent contemplation, he realized something profound: the most dangerous warriors weren't the ones who knew everything. They were the ones who were always willing to learn. And that, above all, was what had made the Deathworlder so powerful. The instructor walked away from the arena, a different man than when he had entered. He had been humbled, yes, but in that humbling, he had discovered something far more valuable than victory. He had discovered growth. He had discovered that even the greatest warriors still had something to learn. And as he glanced back at the Deathworlder, who remained in the center of the arena, the instructor knew that the warrior's lesson had not only been one of strength, it had been a lesson of life. The fight was over, but the real journey was just beginning.